All right, welcome to Halitics. So glad to be talking today. It is Tuesday, and I'm really excited about my guest, Andrew Dickos. He is a writer. The latest book, I believe, is Honor Among Thieves. He writes about cinema. Andrew, thanks so much for joining me today.
Well, thank you for having me, Hal.
I love movies. I don't know nearly as much about them as you do, and that makes me a little nervous because I like to think of myself as kind of an expert on the topics I discuss, and here I'm just going to try to drink in your knowledge.
Hal?
Yes, I'm here. Go ahead, sir. Are you having trouble hearing me?
Sync. We're not in sync. Your voice is okay. Oh,
Go ahead.
No, your voice was not in sync.
I would ask you, don't worry about looking at me then, just listen and then respond.
Okay.
So tell us about Honor Among Thieves. We'll get into maybe some parallels with today's, or we will get into parallels and how maybe the work of Jean-Pierre Melville can help us navigate today. But just maybe a thumbnail sketch about this book that you've published. The way, by the way, viewers can get Honor Among Thieves, click on the link in the description on YouTube.
Well, thank you for having me, Hal, and I'll tell you about Honor Among Thieves. I wrote Honor Among Thieves because originally I included a section on Melville, a brief section in my book on the history of American film noir and his influence on film noir. And I became fascinated with how underserved critical literature was in discussing his work, because his work is very stylized, very much inspired by classical Hollywood cinema in terms of the film noir heroes, Bogart especially, that were defined in that period. And I thought, his films deserve to be recognized a little more. I decided to write this book, modeled pretty much after my first book on Preston Sturges, where I had a brief biographical profile of the man and then a discussion of each of his films.
Well, I'm showing some images. I don't know if you can see them, Andrew, just to
I do see them.
Kind of corroborate or explicate how the cinematography really does harken back. And these are movies from the 60s.
Oh, yes.
I have three movies. I have some shots of. Here's Ledulo. Go ahead.
Melville's most, I think, expressive films are his black and white films. Not that he didn't use color evocatively, he did, but it's hard to beat black and white cinematography when you're talking about film noir. The very nature of film noir, I think, is rooted in the chiaroscuro effect of its black and white cinematography, as it traces its roots back to German expressionist cinema of the silent years. You asked an interesting question about the connection between Melville, his cinema, and our current political moment, which kind of bears investigating a little bit. Melville distinguished himself during the war, as you know, as a member of the French resistance. And the French resistance was probably the most egalitarian expression of the French national theme of fraternité, unité, liberté. Everyone who opposed the occupation and the Nazis was invited. And that made it a very exciting and tragic moment for people to participate. And people like Melville gave their entire lives to that period. So much so that he and his brother, who died at the Spanish border in 1940, um, were committed to it in a way that could have cost them their lives on several occasions. That kind of
and let me just jump in, because
Yes.
what really interested me is Melville was actually, he had born Grumbach. He was Jewish. He was in the French army. He escaped at Dunkirk to England. This is all in your book. This is how I got the information. And yet he could have, ridden out the war in relative safety, right, in England, fighting for the Free French, maybe going back when on D-Day. But instead, he actually went back into occupied France to fight in the resistance. Indeed. It's really quite a remarkable story.
Yes, a testament to his patriotism. And because he was a man of this kind of honorable behavior at a time when many French were distinguishing themselves by their cowardice, it's an interesting counterpoint to those who stayed silent, that Melville and others like him were willing to risk their lives at a time that that was perilous for all who weren't interested in simply getting along silently under the occupation. And the comparison that can be made between someone like Melville then and anyone in our current political moment is almost non-existent. You're not going to find that kind of commitment to public service and patriotism in the truest sense of the word, not as a political pose. You're not going to find it today. To the extent that you see evidence of it is to the extent, I don't know if you watched the opening night of the Democratic convention last night, but to the extent to which you would find an act of patriotism of that magnitude is in someone like Joe Biden, who willingly stepped aside to allow Kamala Harris to assume the nomination because he saw the handwriting on the wall with his nomination against what I think is, for all practical purposes, a neo-fascist Republican Party today. I hope that's not too harsh.
I don't think it's too harsh at all.
But I believe they've displayed all of the characteristics of a neo-fascist movement, and that's something that Joe Biden understands with an urgency that I understand some of his well, I don't want to say handlers, but some of his inner circle said he shouldn't really overplay. He should instead point to his achievements and all the work that's left to do with the programs that he's had implemented. But that's as close to a comparison between the two between our moment and Melville's fight in the resistance that you can draw. Melville himself was not a radical leftist. He was a right winger. And it's very interesting. The counterpoint that you should make to Melville's personal politics is to the climate in France at the end of his career in the late 60s and early 70s, when the whole far left Marxist Maoist movement that that found really a lot of breathing room in the university system of France in the late 60s, excuse me, in the late 60s in France, especially in May of 1968, how that was really quite antithetical to the way that Melville saw himself and people like him who fought a generation earlier in the resistance. To him, that kind of commitment he made to the underground was the true radical patriotism of the moment. And those who were protesting on the campuses of France in 1968 against the war in Vietnam, in which France had been implicated, but also in the crass consumerism that had overtaken their country, and the whole idea of a sterile environment for their prospects as future citizens. All of that was not something that he responded to the way that you would think.
Well, let me just jump in, because there's a few points I just was thinking about, and from your book, I've got up on the screen there. You mentioned there was real heroism, of course, in the resistance, but most, and this is from your book. The quote is, very, very few French willingly chose to resist until they faced a choice between either resist or, get forced into labor, basically become slaves for the Nazi cause.
Right.
So I don't think he would have viewed them as heroes at all. They were, I guess, just survivors if they
exactly.
were that. So
no.
And how does that inform? Because what also fascinated me in your book, and I think there's a connection, is that he saw heroism as pursuing or following a code. Even a criminal could be a hero if they pursued a particular code. And how does that connect? Mm-hmm. Is your duty as a citizen is somehow you follow that? You're a hero, just as if you're a criminal, you follow a criminal code?
Well, a code of behavior in Melville's world is not necessarily defined by your institutional affiliations and whether or not you satisfy some political definition, or I shouldn't say political, but some institutional definition of heroism. You can, as he and a lot of the people who served in the resistance did, come from different backgrounds, but make a commitment to the democratic ideals that France stood for before it sold its soul to the Germans. I mean, there's a big contrast between the work of the French resistance, of which Melville was a part, and the Vichy functionaries who simply lubricated the occupation. And that's the distinction that needs to be made.
Well, I want to quote, I've got a quote up on screen, and this fascinated me again from your book. When we watch Melville's films, especially the film noir, we feel as though we participate in a ceremony of observing heroic behavior. And I put that in, I don't know how well you can see this. I highlighted heroic behavior, preordained and poetic. So you see the heroic behavior in his anti-heroes, in his film noir anti-heroes. So does that mean, and I think it must, that a hitman, a hired gun, somebody who just kills for money can be a hero? Is that correct?
Well, it's not that a hired gun who kills for money is a hero. It's that in the case of the film noirs where he does have criminals who do whack one another and steal from each other, they do it with a sense of purity of purpose. They are as they are supposed to be in their roles, and the way they comport themselves is very much, it defines very much who they are. For example, let's see, I see Alain Delon on the screen right now. Alain Delon, who died yesterday, is an
I knew he
image
died,
of,
but I didn't realize it was yesterday. I just saw an
no,
obit
I'm
as
sorry,
I was preparing, and I had no idea.
it wasn't yesterday. I think it was the day before yesterday. He died. But he comports himself in service to the role that he plays. And that's not cosmetic, that's not uh, superficial. That is both cosmetic and superficial, but it also speaks to the very soul of the character that he plays. That's not heroic in the in the classical sense of a redemptive moral figure, but it is a man is who is destined to play a certain role and plays it to the end. The comparison might be to the Japanese samurai. They killed, but they killed with the kind of formality that defined them as disruptors of their society, of their class. And this is kind of what he and Belmondo, to a lesser extent, Yves Montand in a couple of films. This is who they are, you know.
I wonder whether the experience that a Jewish filmmaker had watching his French compatriots, look with sort of without really any apparent dismay at the Holocaust, if that caused him to view criminals as no worse, no different in many ways morally than the average French person.
I think that's a cogent question. And I think just speculating based on his personal history, that is not an inapt observation, because one can argue that the things that Melville saw during the war and in the underground were sharper contrasts between honor and dishonor than some of the things that his killers and thieves do in the film noirs that he created, which they transact within their milieu. It doesn't affect others. It is something that is pretty much contained within a community that understands the code of behavior displayed. That's very different from the Melville who experienced a betrayal by his countrymen during World War II. If you see Léon Morin-Prêtre, the film that he made about life in a small town during the occupation, with Jean-Paul Belmondo playing a priest, you get an understanding of just how compromised even the minor characters are by what they say and do. And then if you see his masterpiece, the shadow of Army of Shadows, forgive me, Army of Shadows, you see just the kind of commitment that those in the French resistance had to make, from which they couldn't deviate at all. There was no way that you could not be in the resistance. If you were in the resistance, you had to follow the code of behavior and restrictions that were very much a part of that structure that allowed you to carry out the acts of sabotage, of retribution that the resistance did. If you see Army of Shadows, excuse me, you'll notice that the Simone Signoret character, who plays the leader of a cell, does something that compromises the security of the cell. She mentions and shows a picture of her daughter who was taken prisoner. And she realizes when she does that she has exposed herself to those who could imperil the existence of the cell, who could come after her and her compatriots. So she knows that for that, she has to die. It's not that people will, it's not that people will make her feel guilt. She understands the terms of her engagement with the resistance and knows that eventually, when she is in the process of carrying out her duties, she will be killed. That kind of rigorous commitment to behavior is evident in his film noirs, especially in the DeLong characters, who know that what they do has the risk of death always hanging over their shoulder.
What are the lessons? I mean, Melville died over 50 years ago now. He didn't make that many movies. What can we take away today as to how we should behave in a time, of ecocide, a time of genocide, a time of incipient fascism, as you've mentioned? What does Melville say we have to do?
Well, it's interesting. Whether his characters are criminals, resistance, they all lived by a code of behavior that they believed in, that it was an essential part of who they were. The comportment of these characters, the attire they wore, the way they moved, the way they presented themselves visually, only exist to point out that there was an inner core, a soul, if you will, of people who had made the decision to inhabit that role to the very limit, to the end point, the terminus. And I think what Melville would see today is someone like Donald Trump, to use someone in our current political moment, as the very antithesis of that. He would see Trump as the transactional monster that he is, who has no code of ethics except possibly to recognize that in the purity of his megalomania, his egotism, his narcissism, maybe he is an expression of the kind of perfect monster that Melville might find appealing. If you're going to be a bad guy to the core. He would revile someone like a J.D. Vance, without question. I think it's interesting to note that if we can veer from Melville to our current political moment, it's interesting that the things that we see going on in this country today politically, if you and I had a conversation about them a decade ago, and I said to you how this, that, this, and that will transpire over the next decade, you would have laughed me off your podcast and said, "There's no way, Andrew, that that all of these things could come to pass. You're talking about something that wouldn't even sell as a dystopian political thriller in Hollywood." And yet, here we are. Melville, I think, found himself in a situation of conflict in the late 60s and early 70s. But it was an understandable conflict. He understood that he was a man no longer of his time. And he had no sympathy for what was going on the campuses. in the late 60s. But I don't know that he felt that he was talking to a breed of Frenchmen that were not inimical. I can't say the word.
Inimical. Isn't it
Inimical.
inimical is the word? Inimical.
Inimical to the French. I'm wiping my eye here as we're talking, so that's distracting me because of this sky. But that would have been different. That would have been different essentially from the people that he knew during the war and in the resistance. Whereas today, you listen to some people talk who are no longer simply conservatives, but they are members of a party that's no longer the loyal opposition party, but an anti-democratic, neo-fascist party of duly elected liars, cowards, and more than a few thugs. And you ask yourself, where did these people come from? Had they always been among us? And I, maybe in my ignorance and blindness, I didn't see what others have. But
so your takeaway is that citizens have a duty which many French did not meet to fight against. That's how you are here. That's the same code of conduct that there was this code of conduct that a samurai had, that they lived by. And even if they did harm, they lived by that code. Citizens to be good citizens, just like a samurai to be a good samurai. So, but you point out that even during the war, there was resistance by French citizens who weren't necessarily. You say, I'll read exactly. Melville learned that the different modes of resistance by a French citizenry of ambiguous moral stature was fraught with uncomfortable truth and tragedy. So I guess, see, to me, I look at our world and I say, okay, you're right. Trump is evil, or he represents a very, very scary, potentially, or neo-fascist threat. But the alternative ain't great either. The alternative is doing all sorts of bad things too. So under those, and I'm giving you my perspective, yours may be different. Again, under that, in that situation, is it enough to simply stand against Trump, as in the 40s, the French citizenry should have, at least according to Melville, as one stood up to fight the Nazis in the resistance? Is it enough to simply fight Trump, or does our code require us to go beyond that?
Well, I believe it is, because I think the difference is so stark. There was a time. This is an interesting point that you're making. A half a century ago, the political the adversarial relationships that existed between those who saw corruption in government institutions, in the military, in police authority, in judicial misconduct. And they existed and still do. But a half a century ago, it was the citizens who were victimized by this institutional corruption. And so you had an anti-establishmentarian attitude that thrived in the late 60s and early 70s. Today, a half a century later, the script is flipped. And it is the institutions, the very institutions that were reviled then, that are now supposed to be the guardrails of our democratic way of life that will allow the American experiment to continue. And it is the citizenry that has been corrupted. When you see Trumpism infected in the state legislatures that would willingly overturn the results of a free and fair election, when you hear about a program called Project 2025 that would be implemented at every level of municipal and state government, you say to yourself, my God, this is not a breed of citizen that I recognize. This is, I don't think, something that Melville faced. Melville was a man who was a product of the war. And at the end of his life, he didn't recognize the political turmoil of people who protested against the war in Vietnam, and also the consumerist culture that grew up after the war in France. And that was a different argument for Melville. This is not something that he responded to. We don't have that here.
I really appreciate your commentary on this, Andrew, very, very much. Viewers on my podcast, listeners know I don't fully share the same position of our political situation as you do, but I'm not going to get into that right now. I just wanted to give you the microphone. I do want to get back to the art, art for art's sake of Melville for a moment. And then one of his statements that seems to be very prescient. But I have another image, and this is the Melville movie I'm most familiar with, that I feel like I have some knowledge about. Bob LaFlambeur, Bob the Gambler, one of his earlier movies. And I got the shot here of the heroine Isabel Corey on a motorcycle, motor scooter. And you can see Paris in the background. Obviously, he's filming on location. How important is place in these movies? How could they? They're not really universal, right? I mean, his movies are about France in the post-war era.
France. And absolutely, out of specifically Paris, and he was recognized as the film noir filmmaker, the crime drama filmmaker of France at a time when France was enjoying a particular popularity in cinema, both just before the French New Wave, and then during the French New Wave, when Paris, in all its pre-war and in all its pre-war glory and post-war decay, came into focus as an alluring sight. And you certainly do see that in Bob LaFlambeur, which has shots at dawn when Bob has had an adventurous night and goes back, and you see the city waking up from the top of Montmartre. It's just beautiful, and it captures that affection that he had for France, or Paris rather, especially so many scenes that were shot around the 9th arrondissement where he was born. Yeah.
So do we see like was he let me ask it this way, and then I want to talk about today contemporary cinema, and then we can wrap things up. Do you think Melville was consciously, was he a message filmmaker? Or I understand you see the messages, right? Your book, Honor Among Thieves, the Cinema of Jean-Pierre Melville, sees him as an auteur with a consistent message. But my question would be, did he see himself that way?
No, I don't think he did. I don't think he was a message filmmaker, and I'll tell you why. I think any message that comes from his films, if you want to think in terms of a quote-unquote message, has to do with what radiates from the stories told in the characters that he creates. The only films that he made that had a sharp, distinct point of view about commitment were his films about the French resistance. especially his masterpiece, Army of Shadows, where that was modeled after the kind of films that you would have seen at that time on the Japanese screen, the samurai films especially. Uh, this was his commitment, which one can argue is apolitical as much as it is political, because it applies to heroes of all genres, uh, and he saw his resistance, fellow resistance, which I list in my book the names of the resistance that he fought with and upon which he modeled his characters. These were true heroes, and the way they comported themselves as men of honor is a political statement about the value of that honor.
Yeah, I'm with you on this. I mean, usually it seems like message movies are a little simplistic, right? And that's
exactly
his themes. Yes, its place is critical, but ultimately Paris is a microcosm of the world. It's his world, but the themes are universal. So it isn't like a High Noon or something like
it's
that.
interesting you say it's a microcosm of his world, because the Paris that he shot isn't Paris that half a dozen other French filmmakers have shown us. It is the Paris of Pigalle and Montmartre, where he grew up, where he placed his characters. So he created a mood. He created a milieu that was specific to his crime dramas.
Fascinating. Andrew Dickos with us, his book, his latest, Honor Among Thieves, the Cinema of Jean-Pierre Melville. You want more information, just click the link in the description here on YouTube. By the way, don't forget, I haven't asked, but don't forget, click like, click subscribe. We want to get those numbers up. I did post I didn't talk about it, but I've been centering the experience in Gaza. Pretty much every program we're going in a different direction today, but I did post a slide about the latest deaths there. So I'll discuss that more tomorrow. But it sounds like also Melville would have problems empathizing with or sympathizing with Gaza as well, right? Because just as he did with Vietnam, he was a patriot. He was ultimately for France.
But if you want to draw a comparison between our response to Gaza and Melville's response to a foreign incursion by the French in his life, it would be what were his thoughts? What was his feeling about the French involvement in Algeria? And he was relatively silent about that. He did not say as much as, for example, a filmmaker like Godard did about French involvement in other countries, especially Vietnam, and early in Godard's film career in Algeria and the fight for independence there. So, no, what he might say as a Jew, but I don't know that he would necessarily say it as a Frenchman.
You know what's fascinating to me, and this is my take. So as I mentioned, I don't feel particularly confident or comfortable in my expertise in this area, but two of the great commentators of the Nazi occupation, the regime, were in fact conservative. You mentioned Melville. I'm also thinking of Camus, who, as I understand it, was also a supporter of the French occupation of Algeria, was not a supporter of Algerian independence. But yet, when they were confronted with the evil of Nazism, I think their work is clearer and more morally unambiguous than maybe someone like Sartre. So how does that jibe with anything?
Well, it's interesting. You're absolutely right, and Melville, I think, would fit into that category if you wanted to place him in any category. I think, again, what I was talking about earlier in this country about the roles of civic commitment and of institutional corruption being flipped over the course of a half century in this country. I think that that was the case for many who lived through the 60s, but yet distinguished themselves as fighters during World War II. I don't know. And it was complicated in France by the fact that de Gaulle didn't go away. He came back. So there's the de Gaulle who stood for La Patrie in the 1940s, and then there was the de Gaulle of the 60s who was just a relic. You might say that Joe Biden was beginning to see himself as morphing into a de Gaulle-like character and was convinced by his supporters and inner circle to step aside and make way for the new generation, as it were. I don't know. I don't know how it is that you can defend your country in one era and then be opposed to what they do in another era if your country stands for institutions and principles of democracy that should be pretty timeless.
But right. I mean,
yeah,
there's a lot of different ways to look at it. Yeah. I just find it very interesting that, in a book like The Plague.
If we could talk about Gaza for just a second.
Sure.
That's not too far off topic. It's very interesting. I when the Gazans raided that concert and took prisoners and killed Israelis, I could certainly understand the need for retribution and justice. And the two don't necessarily have to be apart. And I thought, that's fine. And when they raided Gaza and the Israelis raided Gaza and destroyed so much property and killed so many lives, I thought, well, retribution is reaching a point where after 40,000 people dead, something isn't right here. This isn't the Israeli people that I hear speaking against the Gazans. This is Bibi Netanyahu's war. And I understand the need for Palestinians in Gaza to stand up and speak out against Hamas. And if they don't, they may be part of the problem. I understand that. And they put themselves in the line of fire when it comes to retribution. But 15,000 or so of those Palestinians are children. And the wanton killing of those children by Israeli forces is something that I can't reckon with the Israeli sense of honor, if you will, since we're invoking Melville here. I don't understand that. And I don't understand how the Israeli army, which is one of the sharpest, best trained armies in the world, can't send a hit squad to get rid of Hamas leadership the way that Melville probably would have done.
Well, I appreciate that analysis, Andrew. Thank you so much.
Well, it's a kind of a far-fetched analysis, but the fact of the matter is we're talking about Melville and Hitman.
Well, I think the U.S. Intelligence has said that Israel cannot eliminate Hamas. It just isn't going to happen. And in fact, their actions now are creating more people who hate Israel and want to do harm to Israel. So it's clearly counterproductive.
But do you not think that do you not think a lot of this was orchestrated deliberately by Bibi Netanyahu?
Well, it seems clear he wants, the war benefits him because he can stay in power. He gets to stay in power as long as it continues. I'm more, honestly, in some ways, I'm more troubled. I'm very, very, very upset about what, is happening there. And I put almost all the blame on Israel, but also the United States, because we can see what Netanyahu's doing. He is, a typical corrupt leader. But why are we backing him to the hilt? And this is why I'm not on board with the idea that Trump is a unique evil that we must face, because I view the Democratic Party as also complicit in this genocide.
The cynical behavior here is rampant. If the Democrats stand up against Netanyahu, they'll be accused of supporting Hamas, and some have already been accused of that. And that will benefit Trump. And, I don't have to draw the lines in this for you to understand how it's being exploited. But
as you point out, the Democrats hear it anyway. They're getting accused of being pro-Palestine or anti-Israel, regardless. I think sometimes you just have to do what's right, and I so often don't see that. Let me switch gears, Andrew, because we only have a few more minutes, and I want to ask you more about cinema. But I really appreciated those insights. Do you watch any contemporary movies? I will be honest with you, I almost never do. I only watch pretty much black and white movies these days. Not so much French, but sometimes. But do you watch contemporary film, and what do you think of it if you do?
Well, I haven't been to the movies in quite some time because I'm involved in a writing project right now. But I think it's interesting. I live on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. And when I moved here 30 years ago, there were 5 single-run theaters. And today, only one is left, AMC. And it rents part of the week as a special events venue for anyone who wants to rent it.
Yeah, it's really sad.
That's sad, but that's where movie going has gone. It's no longer the social activity that it was when going to the movies meant actually going to the movies. And now people have their streaming services, and even friends of mine who I used to attend press screenings with now see movies on their phones and their televisions because they know eventually that's where they'll end up. I think it's been a radical change in the whole idea of movie going, and I don't know that it's ever going to be reclaimed.
I've got this quote up here also from, I don't think this is in your book. Maybe it is. I actually got it from another. Maybe it is. I'm not sure. Can you see that? But this is from Melville saying, I estimate the final disappearance of cinemas as taking place around 2020. So isn't that pretty amazing, right?
Yes. Yes. And that's kind of what's happened. Absolutely. You didn't know about a pandemic, but that's what accelerated it, and that's what's happening. Last year, everyone was so excited with Barbenheimer, the simultaneous release of Oppenheimer and Barbie, and the box office records they broke, and a lot of us were thrilled at the prospect that this might be the revival of healthy movie-going cinema. But alas, it turned out to be a false alarm because nothing this year I think has opened that's even of much note. Have you seen
I wanted
anything?
to bring up a movie that I watched, not in the theater. I don't even know if I assume it was a release. It was up for an Academy Award or several, that I did find very intriguing, Zone of Interest, which is a Holocaust movie. I don't know if you've heard of that or seen it, but it's based on a
Zone of Interest.
You did. What was your reaction to it?
I'm not altogether interested in the psychological anguish and how do I want to put this? If not anguish,
You felt that he centered the Nazis, right?
maneuverings of those people who knew what was going on but tried to live their lives in denial of it.
And I understand that criticism. I really do. In fact, that was my initial reaction. But I think
I have a mother who was in the Greek underground during World War II, so I grew up listening to war stories, and this is something that I have little sympathy for that. Just as I have little sympathy for a film like The Reader. You remember The Reader?
I did not see that. I'm not
with Kate
familiar
Winslet,
with that.
who played a concentration camp guard who was taught how to read by a young German years after. Oh. I'm reading this stuff, and I'm saying, you're trying to get me to feel a human response to people who behaved like monsters. It's kind of hard for me to do that.
I didn't feel like that was the case in Zone of Interest. I think what the filmmaker did there, and it's different from the book, but the filmmaker did there, I felt, was just to, again, show how this can happen. I don't think there was really, I never saw any sympathy expressed for the commandant or his family. I think they were portrayed as just everyday monsters. That was my reaction. But it's true, the victims were not centered. So that can be very problematic.
Yeah. Isn't it interesting how, in retrospect, looking back, people acquire, in my view, human contour and understanding about their denial or complicity in monstrous behavior, or in just ignoring something or denying its existence can be a monstrous gesture. I think to myself, would it have taken that much courage for you to say no or to resist in your time? You know?
Do you think part of the problem with movies today, or why the cinema is fading away, as predicted by Melville, is that movies are just crappy? They're just not very good. I mean, I risk the old fogeyism, right? Everything used to be better when I was a kid.
Oh, but no, not at all. Because you like me, I'm sure, watch a lot of things on your streaming services, and a lot of visual content, which is now the preferred phrase for movies, films, cinema. You and I both watch a lot of challenging visual content on our streaming services that is cinematic. It's beautifully shot, acted, and written. It's that the activity of movie going is gone. You no longer buy a ticket, get a seat, sit down, meet your friend after the movie for a drink, or go to lunch and then go to the movies. You no longer have to wait in a queue to get tickets to a blockbuster. That activity is gone. You know, even a place like Film Forum here in New York, which offers discriminating film fare, independent cinema, classics. Who's going to go to Film Forum to see a re-release of Third Man in 70 millimeter when they can rent it or buy it and have it available to them anytime they want it at home on their couch, watching it on their couch? You know, you're going to say quite rightly, it's not the same experience. Of course it's not. It's films were never designed to be seen up close and personal from your couch, but that's where film is now.
Well, it's so much more convenient. I mean, look, and now with the proliferation of very large, 50 plus inch, 75 inch TVs,
absolutely,
with all the surround sound you can get at home, it isn't even that much different, except for the communal aspect watching at home.
Absolutely. Not only that, I was helping a friend to move back to New York from LA, and he wanted help mounting his 65-inch screen. And I told him, no, I'm not going to help you mount this because I don't think the wall will support it. I think it'll come crashing down. And he insisted it wouldn't, but we didn't do it. But no, that's a screening option for him now. And as far as movies, the availability of movies go, my sister, who lives in Rockford, Illinois, has available to her through her streaming services all sorts of independent cinema and foreign cinema that was previously unavailable through release. It was not available in the circuits of movie theaters that were available to her where she lived. But now she sees everything.
I think I think everything we're discussing now are reasons that cinema isn't going to rehabilitate itself or become the kind of pastime that it once was, where my mom, that's how I know Andrew through my mother, and he are in a class together.
Yes.
But when she was a girl, she would talk about going to the movies every Saturday afternoon.
Absolutely.
And sitting there with her best friend and watching every
Saturday. And I saw double bills. And I remember New York City, when New York City had art film houses and rep houses, 16 when I moved here in the early 70s. All right. Today, you can't count more than 4.
It's very sad.
It
really
sad.
is.
It's very sad.
We've lost something, although, as you point out, we can all see the movies. We can all see the movies whenever we want, just by going to YouTube or indeed, TCM or something. What about the stage? It seems to me that live theater provides something that you cannot replicate at home. At least so far, we haven't seen that. I did go see a play in Manhattan a few months ago.
Now we're drifting into theater, and the theater season here in New York has been pretty lackluster this year. But I want to say something about the French. It is interesting. A contrast to us would be the French movie-going habits today in Paris. Paris has theaters, and they are attended. They have neighborhood theaters, and people go to them. A film like Barbie will open in Paris, and then it will go to smaller theaters around Paris. And you don't have that here. Here, when Barbie makes a splash, 6 months later, it's available on streaming. So that's a difference in movie-going behavior, you see.
And do you attribute that to the very quick release of these movies on
I attribute
TV or whatever?
I attribute that to technology. I mean, we've become a culture where everything that's important to us is accessible or viewed on a device. I'm talking to you through my laptop as we speak. If I lose my phone, I panic in a way that I never did when I lost my wallet. My life is on my phone. So this is the transformation in communication that we've lived through it's been accelerated even in our lives over the last 20 years. I mean, 10 years ago, we didn't have access to the kind of visual content that we have today. And 20 years ago, a lot of what we do today would have seemed almost like something out of science fiction.
Yeah, no question, right? I mean, in 30 years, you go back to the 90s, really, there wasn't even an internet until there was, but it wasn't at all widespread. I don't think it was so around.
In the 90s, we had beepers. Remember those?
Yeah. I remember those even into around 2000, the beepers,
yes.
People with those.
And so that's where we are.
It's a great conversation.
Is the movie-going culture has changed. When I moved to New York, I used to go with a friend of mine to Carnegie Hall Cinema, at at 7 o'clock Friday evening and watch movies overnight until Saturday at noon. Never left the theater except to go pee. And all we did was get high and watch movies. And they would just run over and over again. Uh, uh, Old movies, a schedule of movies by certain filmmakers, and that's how we acquired our cinema literacy. But now
So
they don't.
before I let you go, because we're at the hour plus mark, and I try to be mindful of my listeners' impatience with me. I do want a final word from you, but in specific to Melville, I mean, I know you've always been interested in him, because I remember when we talked maybe a decade, it was over a decade ago, I believe, and this was before you wrote Honor Among Thieves. You were very interested in Melville.
No,
and
it was
French.
after I wrote Honor Among Thieves.
Say again?
It was before I wrote, yes.
Yeah,
You're
yeah.
correct.
I'm saying it was before, because I saw 21-22, right? It was released around the end of 21. Is that correct?
Yes.
The publication date. So this was well before that, but we did talk about French movies, French cinema, and specifically Melville. Is it his life story? The movies, as I understand it, he's considered one of the greatest, right? I mean, maybe greater than a Truffaut or a who did the Reckless?
That was Godard.
Godard, right? So he's right there, maybe with. I hate to. Can you compare him to Jean Renoir? Is he in that league? Is he?
He was the Godfather type inspiration to the French New Wave in their early careers, because Melville created a style of movie making. He didn't rely on the studios. He didn't rely on the industry at the time to make his first films. He sought independent financing, and he produced them himself, and he directed them himself. And that served as a model to the French New Wave. That's why they admired him. And they admired the fact that he didn't treat genre cinema, especially Hollywood genre cinema, with disdain. So I would say that he is maybe not up there with Renoir and Bresson, but he could be the handmaiden to them.
How do you explain, final question, and then you get the last word on anything you like, Andrew, but just something that has occurred to me. How do you explain the great French movies that were made during the occupation? And I'm thinking The Raven or Le Corbeau, because they don't seem to have two words for raven and crow in French. It's all just Corbeau, which I don't understand. But also, the one with Arletty. I can't remember.
Children of Paradise.
Yeah, Enfants du Paradis. Right. How do you explain that under occupation by a fascist regime, they could make among the greatest movies ever?
Not only that, but a number of artists, actors, screenwriters, and directors were able, if not to thrive, then to survive during the occupation. In part because they kept themselves partially hidden. I mean, Simone Signoret, who was half Jewish, should not have had the start of her career during the occupation, yet she did. She knew how to duck and how to circumvent trouble when it came at her. And Carnet was able to manipulate the French film industry in a way that allowed him to hire a number of people who would otherwise have been deported to the camps because they were either Jews or troublemakers. So it was that menagerie of circumstances that allowed people to just get around a lot of the restrictions that were imposed upon them later in the occupation, not at first, not in 1940 and 41, but in 42 and 43, when people started running out of food and fuel, and the Nazis decided that what was available was going to go to their occupying forces for the French citizenry.
All right, final word. If you want to talk about just a message of the, that you take away from the life of and work of Jean-Pierre Melville, or some other related idea.
Well, to stick with Melville, because that's the focus of our discussion. I think with the changing climate in filmmaking, and the way films are produced and what they cost to make and how they are distributed, someone like Melville wouldn't have the opportunity to distinguish himself today the way that he did in the wreckage of post-war Paris. And also because the creative communities are not so intertwined as they were then. I mean, Melville knew the artists and writers of his moment. If not intimately, then he was familiar enough with them to engage them as screenwriters or as readers of his scripts. And that's something that is easy to do today because of the cost of filmmaking and the rather refracted structure of movie making. Every film now becomes a production company in order to be made. It isn't made by a studio. And that's, for all the criticism that got years ago, it was also one of the reasons why a lot of work was done and why a lot of people were employed.
I want to thank you so much. What a pleasure for me to speak with Andrew Dickos.
Well, thank you for allowing me to ramble on like this. It was always...
I don't think you were rambling, Andrew. If you rambled, then it's...
It was a pleasure. It was a pleasure to chat with you, Hal.
All right. I'll be back tomorrow. More politics. I'll get back to my usual focus more on contemporary politics and talk about the Democratic Convention. We did allude to that today. Thanks again, Andrew Dickos. I'll be back tomorrow.